you turn them on?
We can be very no.
Do,
Don't do that. Don't.
do we turn them on ourselves or?
Yeah.
So.
Oh.
Okay. There we go. It's on. Hot mic.
It's now you know. You're welcome. No, okay. So embarrassing. Hey, how have you been? Oh, jeez. Okay. Did they give you a skateboard for that at least, or like a? Okay, that helps. Oh. Yeah.
Thank you.
That's why I'm sitting down.
Yeah.
Just sit for now.
What were you moderating?
Yeah,
if you
yeah,
don't mind
yeah.
me
Oh my
asking?
gosh.
The new face in Jewish comics.
That's interesting.
How dare you?
All right, look at you.
It's
Oh,
a little
wow, that's how
soggy
you
in the
do it.
midsection, a little rotund, but
Oh my gosh,
it has
you're so
feelings.
good at this.
Yeah,
That's why they give her the bucks.
You know
Give
what?
them a raise.
Yeah, exactly.
I sure did.
That's why they won the strike.
Yes. Where are you based?
Current, technically Burbank, but the Los Angeles area.
Oh, cool. Nice.
Yourself?
I'm in Brooklyn.
Oh, okay, cool.
Yeah,
I know
yeah,
it's-
yeah. So the flight was
in the well. Well,
as
there's
long
so
as
many
we can,
years
you
of
know?
journey.
Yeah.
Where'd you get in?
I got in yesterday.
Stand like
It was
a
funny. I got in yesterday at like 1 p.m. and I was at Comic Con at 1:30.
Oh,
Yeah.
have you had time to rest?
Oh yeah, I was knocked out last night. Yeah, for sure.
Oh, nice to meet you. Nice to see you. If she wasn't in Hawaii.
I think this is yours, right?
Yes.
Okay,
It's
great.
not. I actually took the train down because I found out that
No,
the
I
train
drank
got
some
fixed,
water.
and I said, I don't want to.
Good.
I don't want to leave my car
Plus,
out on
it's
that
always
side
that
of
thing
town.
like, music
She's like, I know.
Because I need to be doing it with my hands. And it's a thing.
Yeah, no, it's a pleasure. Nice to meet you.
Are you here the whole weekend or just for?
Oh, I'm here until
Old
Sunday.
college.
Oh, nice.
friends.
Yeah, but it's like I was telling them that like this is like my first Comic Con ever, like
Oh.
attending period, like anywhere. So the fact that Macmillan just like picked me up and just like whoop, dropped me in like the biggest Comic Con is like.
Have you ever
this
done
is a lot.
any other?
We're just
convention
talking
in
amongst
Minnesota?
ourselves for a second.
I think the last convention I did, which was my second one ever, was like in October of last year, and before that it was like 4 years ago. So.
Okay, so
Yeah, but now I'm in full convention mode.
I've never
I
been.
think this
how do you like
year.
it? How do you liking it?
It's good. I'm finally
always
doing
been
research on like, well, how do people lay out the tables, what the final
Right,
stuff look like, how to, yeah. So it's really good intel because it gets crowded and it's very visually like sensory. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. Are you also tabling?
No, not this time.
All right, we're going to go ahead and get started. You have arrived at Growing and Becoming, Protagonists Coming of Age Experiences panel, and we've got a great program for you. Why don't we start with our panelists introducing themselves?
Good afternoon. It's noon, so I guess good noon, everybody. My name is Jose Pimienta, pronouns they, them. I'm a cartoonist, and my most recent book was Twin Cities, which is about these twins living in the city of Mexicali who, one they graduate 6th grade, one decides to study middle school on the American side, and the other one decides to stay on the Mexican side. And it's predominantly exploring, like the concept of identity and exploring just like the idea of what what is nationality and what is identity. So so thank you for having me. I'm glad to be here.
Hi, my name is Deb JJ Lee professionally, but if you know me in real life, people call me JoJo now. I'm also a they, them. I wrote a book called In Limbo, which came out earlier this year in March, and it is a graphic memoir of the intersection of being Korean and extremely depressed. And I would say that I think like marketing tends to like push it as more of like, oh, it's a coming home story about being in New Jersey and it being Seoul, Korea. But I like to say that it's less about diaspora and more about navigating really tricky relationships, learning to not have to accept forgiveness if you don't want it, or learning to give forgiveness to other people if you want to. So, but yeah, this book it was a lot. Fun fact is that the publisher almost didn't take the book because it was too dark. So had to make it a little happy. So yeah, thank you for having me.
And I hear too, this is your first
This is my
Yay,
first.
big hand, yay.
This is my first Comic-Con like attending ever period, so it's a lot.
First panel ever?
Oh no, not my first panel, but
Okay.
this is actually my 5th panel with Victoria,
Oh.
who
All
will be
right.
introducing
wow.
herself soon.
I'm sorry I'm in the way. I'm Dan Santat, best known for picture books. I'm best known for The Adventures of Beagle, The Unimaginary Friend, which won the Randolph Caldecott Medal in 2015. Today I'm talking about my memoir, which came out in February, called The First Time for Everything, and it is the story about when I was 13 years old after 2 tumultuous years in middle school and trying to find myself getting comfortable in my skin once again, and I traveled through Europe for 3 weeks and went on all kinds of hair-raising adventures, like having my first beer at the Hofbräu House, having shared a cigarette with 2 girls from France, and sneaking into Wimbledon and watching the 1989 men's semifinal between John McEnroe and Stefan Edberg for £3, and ultimately also meeting a lovely girl from St. Louis and having my very first girlfriend and pen pal. So yeah, it's a pleasure to be here. My pronouns are he, him.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Victoria Yang. My pronouns are she, her. I am talking about my book, Hungry Ghost. I'm a cartoonist and an author. I also have a background in animation. My book, Hungry Ghost, is a YA coming-of-age tale. It is based on real experiences, but it is not a memoir. It's a memoir-like, but it's about growing up Asian American and dealing with body image issues and an eating disorder.
Thank you. And I don't know if I introduced myself. I'm Tina Lerno. I'm a comics enthusiast. I'm a librarian for the Los Angeles Public Library, and I also came from a career in animation as well.
Oh, nice.
Yay.
My
So
condolences.
I wanted to start off by asking everybody, what prompted you to write something so personal?
I have to start that one. I guess, guys, it's such a big question, but I'll try to keep it short. I think for me it was both, it's an exercise of exploration of my own identity and just kind of looking back on just reassessing and trying to reflect on lived experiences. But it was also a sense of missing and loving my hometown so much, just because it's so unique in the sense that it's this city, in the border with California, with a small town, and just like that dynamic is very interesting. It's also a city that has a big Chinese population, so our local cuisine is Chinese food, which is very unique to the region because it's made with Mexican ingredients. So yeah, what prompted me to write that book specifically was that when I graduated 6th grade, I was given the option to study on the American side because in the 90s, it was still perceived that education in the U.S. was superior to education in Mexico. I know, and and same price too. So I chose to stay in Mexico, but I kept wondering, well, what would have happened had I not? And those were like the beginning ideas of like why I started exploring that. So, yeah.
Cool. So I think there's like 2 parts to my answer. I think I've always wanted to do a little archive of like I went. Am I allowed to swear?
Yes.
Yeah.
I went through a
No,
lot
well,
of
I
shit.
mean, according to this.
We're the library.
Yeah, whisper it. Whisper it.
I went through a lot of shit. Like even at like I think by the time I was 10, I remember recalling like I really want to write about what I went through, but I was like 10. So I was like, oh, I'll wait. And then fast forward to 12 years later, I was like 22, and I went through more shit at that point. And I really just tripped into comics, I think. I never saw myself as working in books. I never saw myself working in comics. I didn't grow up with many comics. I wasn't allowed to read comics. So I had to read it online. Like under my covers. But what prompted me to make In Limbo was actually purely accidental. So I was working in Silicon Valley, yikes, as a UX designer at the time after I graduated. and I moved to the Bay Area, and I noticed that, like, damn, there's a lot of Korean people here, and I'm feeling a little angsty because I felt like a certain sense of like, oh, I need these people to know that I'm also Korean, but I can't really like express that because I can't speak Korean very well. So I felt like this sense of like, oh, I'm not really in the inn anymore because my parents aren't here. So I kind of channeled that angst into like a 4-page comic. I think that was like the second comic I've ever made in my life, and probably the longest comic I've made in my life at that point. And I did what you do, you put it on Twitter, and it actually kind of went viral. And I think the reason it went viral was because Michelle Zahner, who wrote Crying in H Mart, actually retweeted it. And that's how we started.
Wow.
That's how we started working. So sometimes now I draw posters for her band, which is my favorite band. But she doesn't know that. This was before Crying in H Mart came out or like was announced. So I was like, why did she retweet this? And now it makes a lot more sense. And it went around, and my agent was like, oh, you like making comics? And I was like, I guess. And he's like, do you want to make a graphic novel? And I was like, I guess. So I went gung ho on making a pitch, and it got picked up like in like a half hour by like my dream editor, which was crazy. And then that's how it kind of spiraled into this bad boy. But yeah, it was like something that I wanted to do for a very long time, and I really just like did a little pleasant whoopsie into the graphic novel world, and here I am.
Nice.
Yeah.
I just want to begin by commending everybody on this panel for actually sharing like really heavy emotional stories about their lives. For me, so my initial jaunt into the memoir wasn't initially this project. It was going to be a story about when my mom had breast cancer, and went home to Thailand with my family and just got to meet this whole other part of my family that I never knew, like aunts, uncles, because my family, we basically were just expats that moved out to the United States, and I never got to know my grandmother or anybody else in that family. And what gets involved with that is that you formulate these opinions about your parents, and there can be a lot of emotional heavy lifting that's involved with that. And I would write multiple drafts of the story, and my editor, Connie Shu, would just come back and say, these are very angry. You have some issues, right? And I said,
me too.
yeah, and I said, oh, I know.
You have the same editor.
Right, and so out of the blue, my 13-year-old son at the time, he just asked me out of the blue, like, Dad, when was the first time you ever fell in love? And I remember thinking when I was 13 years old, I would never ask my father that question, And so I was really flattered by the fact that he was curious. And I think it was because it was just around that time in middle school where girls were starting to take a fancy to him, and he was just like, I don't know what to say. And I took a moment and I thought about it, and then I remembered this 3-week trip to Europe that I took, and he wanted to know all about what it was like when I was 13, and I told him every detail, and his mind was blown about the freedom that we had as Gen Xers, just going to Paris, and then the tour guide would say, all right, everybody, have fun. We'll see you at the Eiffel Tower at 5. And I would go speak at schools, and it's funny because all the kids are like, your adults were insane back then. And the truth was, you'd see all the teachers and principals, and they say, yeah, that was the 80s. That was how we were raised. And I find it really interesting that we're in a place now where we have our own kids, and yet we shelter and we coddle them so much, and we say, don't do that, don't go there, that's going to kill you, you're going to die if you eat that. And yet we came from a place where we ran wild. And I don't know how we ended up here, but I remember talking to my editor while we were doing another revision of this really heavy story about my mom with breast cancer, and then I just tell her on the side, like, oh yeah, let me tell you about this time, my son asked me about the first time I fell in love, and then I told him this whole story. And from beginning to end, I tell her this story, and Connie was just quiet. She just didn't say a peep, and then she said, how come you've never told me this story before? And I said, oh, because we're working on this really tragic story about my mom with breast cancer. He's like, no, forget that. You're never going to get anywhere close to that yet, like you're not ready. She said, drop what you're doing. This is your next memoir. because it's already there. It comes from a beautiful, happy place. It's like one of your happiest moments in your life, and this will teach you how to make a memoir, right? And that opened up some other venues where I had to reach out to the girl that is in this story, because she found me on Facebook, and we reconnected. And so we've known each other for about 33 years. But like the day it came where, you know, I said, oh, should I tell her? And, you know, lovely Raina Telgemeier, you know, I read drama, and she had, you know, she had confessions of someone she had a crush on in middle school. And I said, Raina, I'm doing this book. I don't know if I should tell this girl. And she was just like, yeah, of course. You can't just write a book about this girl and then like have it come out one day and no one knows about it. You're like, that's not gonna fly really well. And so ended up, that's how I ended up doing this book. And if anything, it turned this entire project into a lovely big reunion with everybody who was involved in the trip.
So I'd always wanted to do a comic. Like, I got into art because I loved comics so much, and I told everyone I wanted to write and draw comics, but then in college, I was informed that there's not a lot of money in comics. So I pivoted and ended up in animation, but after a few years there, I rediscovered my love of telling stories, and I came back to comics because it's such a good way for one person to be able to do that, as opposed to like film and television, which requires like so many different people, so many approvals, all these stuff. So I actually started to write comics again, but my first graphic novel series is actually a middle grade fantasy series called City of Secrets.
Fantastic, by the way.
Thank you. Yeah. And Dan blurbed it. So, I loved writing that series, and I always thought that's what I wanted to write, was these like big epic fantasies, but then events in my life kind of led me to face my own history, and that's not something that like we as immigrant kids are used to doing. So it just really hit me when I was dealing with my own body image stuff that I really wanted to tell a story about growing up Asian American and not really seeing my own experiences with body shaming and fat phobia that that I usually saw in like Western media. So I wanted to tell a story that kind of reflected my experience, because I knew that that would reflect someone else's experience too. And being able to do this as not a memoir was actually also pretty freeing, because I wasn't as constrained by the truth. Like, I was able to look at emotional truth without actually being too tied to the facts of exactly what had happened. So I really had a good time doing this book, and my next book is going to be very similar in this vein, just because I really found it very freeing. But yeah, so that's how this book came about.
Thank you. And you sort of answered this question, but I wanted to delve into it a little bit more, which is why now? Was there something that prompted you in your life right now to want to tell this particular story?
Well, for me in particular, there is a climactic moment in the story where the main character, she confesses to her mother that she has bulimia, and instead of getting the reaction that she expects, which is like sympathy and, you know, concern, she kind of gets like the brush off from her parents. And I had that happen to me, and I didn't know what to do with those feelings. So I wanted to write a book to try to explain to my mother what it felt like to have an eating disorder. And then in the process of writing this book, I kind of realized that it wasn't for her at all. It's actually for other people, so especially teenagers. So that's why that book came about when it did.
I hear these stories, and I don't think I can speak for every Asian person, but typically when I talk to other Asian folks about growing up with Asian parents who have immigrated to this country, and you hear these things, you hear these shocking things that normally someone would say, oh my gosh, that's awful. I don't think there's ever a case where an Asian person is surprised, Like, I think I went through the same issues as Victoria did, where my dad would just be like, maybe you should stop eating because you're fat. Like, they would say it straight to your, and yeah, I know, he's laughing. And the thing is, culturally, the understanding is, and it's just bizarre to me. I'm so westernized that it's hard for me to understand, but it's, well, do you want me to be dishonest? And it's like, no, I just don't want you to say anything. And there's just this, I'm still trying to process my own feelings about my father, about the whole idea of him being so honest about it. And it's like, is he trying to twist a knife in me because he's hoping that he's going to break me to the point where I say, yeah, maybe I should be thin, you know? Like, I totally understand that plight, right? And I think you come to this realization that culturally we're so different that you're almost never going to come to this understanding with one another, right? And I mean, like, I really tip my hat to Victoria and Deb, and just the ability to have this courage to confront those things, because there's also a sense of, well, me personally, you know, despite the scars that I might have from what my parents say, there is this feeling of loyalty that you have, because there's very much a thing embedded in Eastern culture where if you are born, you owe your parents life. You owe them like this honor to do whatever it is that they ask you to do, because they gave you life, and that's what makes it so hard. You know, I have a degree at UCSD, a microbiology degree, and I was accepted into dental school, and I do nothing with that degree. They even asked me to come do a commencement speech, and that was my opening thing, like, it's an honor to be here. I have a microbiology degree. I do nothing with it. I make children's books. But there was something about it that I knew from the second I graduated from high school. I was so upset because I went there knowing that I was going to get a degree I never even wanted, but I felt like I owed to my parents. And that's where this comes from. That's where it comes from, you know, being Asian American. You're conflicted because you grow up, you know, in a Western society. You talk about feelings, you know, and you want to be validated. But your parents, they come from another different place where it's just like, no. Like, you never question what I say. Like, I'm your parent. Like, I am the moral authority in here. You don't question what I say. And I just wasn't ready to tell that story. You know, it was just too hard. So, you know, like I said, I commend these folks right here for being able to tell that story. In my case, I mean, just by looking at the cultural zeitgeist of kid lit these days, there's just a lot of emotional, heavy topics that are being thrown about. And we need those stories, but I kind of came from a place where I said, you know what? I think I want to tell a story to kids where it comes from hope and a lot of fun, and in the particular sense of just coming out of a pandemic, you know, where kids, I mean, I don't know about your kids, but my kids and their friends, they got messed up, you know. My oldest son had to go, you know, he was doing the Zoom therapy, he got on medication and things like that. Like, he fell into a bout of depression. And what transpired from that was just more adult infighting about politics and the climate and how messed up, you know, everything in the world is. Black Lives Matter, Me Too. And then once we slowly came out of this pandemic, I noticed that no one ever took the time to look at kids and say, you will be okay. If you got through this pandemic, you can get through anything. There's something about resilience, there's something about grit, and no one ever told them that they would be okay, right? And so for that, I felt like I wanted to do a different type of story where I gave kids the hope, because I think we can all universally agree that middle school was the worst period of our lives. Like, I've even spoke at middle schools, and I've spoken with teachers and principals, and I've spoken to teachers all over the country, and they're like, no, 8th grade is like ground zero of just pure evil. And then it just kind of, it's just this horrible virus that once you get it, it just permeates and carries these scars to the rest of your life, right? And to imagine to be someone who went to junior high during a pandemic or whatever, like, I can't imagine what's going through a kid's mind. But I ultimately made this story, and it was, for me, like, there was nothing better than making this book during a pandemic, being able to revisit, like, the happiest moment of my life that got me to those last 2.5, 3 years. But just ultimately having a book with a message that tells every kid out there that no matter what happens, even the tumultuous years of middle school, after that, it's all downhill. Like, it's all, you're gonna be okay. And that was really what I wanted to, portray.
Thank you.
Damn, Dan.
Yeah.
Wow.
Follow that, Jojo.
Yeah, mine is a little bit less inspirational than this. I think I wrote my book at like maybe a little bit too early. I actually like struggled a lot with like it was similar to you where Connie, our editor, in the middle of me writing this book, she was like, "You're still really angry. Like, I honestly don't know if you're actually ready to write in Limbo." And I was like,
I can only imagine Connie like emailing both of us like
At the same
simultaneously,
time.
like, you guys.
she should
Our
have like
case,
she
right,
should have
right,
emailed both
yeah.
of us at the same time, like same exact email.
CC
Both
Guys,
of you
you're
snap
not
out of it.
ready.
Yeah.
I mean, like I have a lot of resentment, or I had, and I still kind of do have a lot of resentment towards the book. Just there was like a lot of things that I was unpacking still from high school, from middle school. Like, I mean, I would describe the beginning of making this book as one giant like call out post. I felt like I was really blaming everybody but me for like the way that I was acting, the way I was behaving, the way I reacted to like my own mental spiral.
I was the same.
Yeah,
right?
yeah, exactly. And there was like a pivotal moment in the book where I basically tried to like unalive myself, and I blame other people for it. And there was, and like during the, I mean, Connie was like my kind of like my other therapist for a second, and I bet she was like, I don't get paid enough for this, but she didn't say that, but I think I imagine that's what she's thinking. But there was a point where she suggested like, you know, like, do you think it's not other people, but it's like the way, like, sure, like you were in a weird circumstance, but do you think it's actually also how other people, or like the way you reacted to the way your circumstances, right? There's like a good way to cope, there's a bad way to cope. I was the latter. And I was also thinking about like, okay, there's a lot of resentment in this book, and there's gonna be a point when it comes out, and there are going to be people from my high school who would read this book. And I really, for a while, thought that everyone in high school like hated me. And I came to realize like over time when I started like seeing people from high school again, I was like, yeah, like, what was your perception of me in high school? Because we never spoke. And they're like, oh, no, you're fine. Like, you're fine. And I think about this scene in the Cartoon Network show Over the Garden Wall, which I do have a tattoo of on my arm.
Nice.
There's a scene where, if you're not familiar with the show, like, you kind of, like, there's two main characters. You kind of, over time, like, get a sense of, like, who they are, like, in their home, like, what their lives are like, and how people perceive them. And the main character, one of the main characters, the older one, you kind of, like, the way he described himself, you're like, okay, you're a loser in high school, you play the clarinet, you're cringe, whatever. And at the end, in one of the last episodes, you kind of see him in the past, and you see him, like, in high school, and he, like, barges into a party that he's not invited to for, like, accidental reasons. And he's like, oh my gosh, like, everyone's gonna, like, hate me. Like, I'm in this party that I wasn't invited to. And then everyone's like, oh, hey, like, good to see you. Like, how are you doing? And I felt like that was me. Like, people just, I didn't really have a lot of friends in high school because I didn't allow myself to be, like, open, like, hey, come talk to me, because I was very shy. If I were doing this 10 years ago, I would be hyperventilating. So it's really cool that I'm in a place where I can do that. So halfway through the book, we had to like shift gears, and the book like basically had to change entirely of like, oh, it wasn't really everyone's fault. Like, sure, people were like kind of mean, were pretty racist, said some pretty nasty things, but like it's also the way that I like process that. So as a result, the entire book had to change. So it was it became less of a call out post and more of like a, all right, like, I'm gonna put all my cards on the table. Like, I was a kind of a shitty person in high school. What? Excuse me? But no, I was also worried about, like, I think the people that I was really thinking about when I was writing this were people from my high school. Because I didn't want, like, I think one of the saddest scenarios to me would be them reading it and them being like, oh my gosh, like, Deb really hated us. But I felt like that outcome would be so sad. So instead, I like made it as diplomatic as possible. Like there were multiple conversations that I eventually condensed into one, because this bad boy was going to be at 500 pages, and I would not wish that on my worst enemy, or I would. So yeah, lots of things were condensed, and I made people very vague. Like, I was like, this could be anybody, and so that nobody from like my life would point that and be like, oh, that was this person, or that was that person. Like, I just made people very generic, and like the same microaggression was like 3 conversations that were the same microaggression became one generic thing. So lots of work condensing that. Yeah.
Did you have resistance from family members? Were there people you felt concerned about asking for permission, or like, hey, you may not?
Yeah, my
come out, so-
mom especially, because my mom is like, I mean, like, I mean, slight spoiler, like, but like a little out of context. Like, I had to like, one of the most pivotal moments in the book is when my mom, like, essentially, like, I had this hard time, like, coming to terms with, like, this is what it's called. But my mom basically tries to commit, like, goes through the motions of, like, a murder-suicide on me and her. And, like, that's essentially what happens. And so I told my mom, like, hey, like, there's gonna be this and this and this and this. Like, I like sent her the drafts, like, you can read it, like, I'm warning you, like, this is what's gonna happen. She's like, no, it's fine, just make me look hot. And I'm like, okay, yeah, easy, done. I'm like, yeah, I mean, easy. My mom is a very beautiful person. Yeah, but anyway, yeah, I mean, my mom still hasn't read the book. I don't expect her to. My dad has read the book multiple times, and he was like, yeah, it's like uncomfortable, but like, I think you did a good job, so cool. I am a little worried that, so we just got a Korean offer in Limbo to be translated and distributed in Korea, which is crazy to me because neither Connie or I like expected that this would happen. Like, we thought that would never happen because the Korean market would not be very interested in like, what's it like growing up Korean? Because it's like, well, they know. That's just another day for them.
Well, growing up Korean in America, though.
Yeah, sure. Okay, yeah, you're fine. Okay, but I think my dad found out that they're going to be distributing this in Korea now, where most of my family is. He was like, you have to like remove our names from the book. Like, he was like, can you please remove our names? And I was like, okay, fine, easy. Because their full names are only at the beginning of the dedication. So, and that makes me really, like, I understand, but the idea that my grandparents, who had no idea what my life was like growing up here, are going to pick this book up and they're gonna read it and be like, oh my gosh, like, they're going through some shit. And, you know, thinking about the idea that their daughter or their daughter-in-law was treating, like, her kid like this was like, I'm a little scared for how they'll react to that. So it's gonna be really heartbreaking that, I mean, they're old. Like, that's gonna be one of the last things that they'll see is that, like, we never had a full conversation with our grandkid, and this is the conversation that we're having, and this is how it's gonna turn out. So I'm a little sad about that. Yeah. Anyway. Yeah.
Yeah, that's hard, but that's definitely the truth. Like,
Yeah.
I just,
go ahead.
it may also be cathartic though.
I think
Like,
so.
I mean, like,
Yeah.
because it may also just be like, I don't know, like, I have I had 2, but I have a grandmother, and I mean, there's always that moment of, even when you allow the darkest of things to be seen, sometimes the role can also just be like, well, thank you for telling me. You know, like, so, I mean, I understand the anxiety. I definitely understand the anxiety. But, like, who's to say that maybe who's to say that that's going to be the actual response? Like, maybe the response is going to be more like, we finally know.
Yeah.
And, you know, like, and be more embracive about it. But I'm an optimist, so, like, so don't do that.
Sure, yeah, no, who knows? Like, I mean, it's I'll never know for now, so we'll see how it pans out.
I think that you're so brave for showing your
Word.
parents
Yeah.
the whole time. Like,
Oh, God.
I got asked a lot.
I just had to.
Yeah.
I mean, I got asked a lot, like, has your mom read the book? And I'm like, no. And also, I never showed it to her before.
But you bought
Yeah.
a copy.
Huh? She
She
did
got-
buy a
she
copy
did buy
at
a
the
copy.
launch, but she hasn't read it, which I'm actually glad for.
My parents never read any of my books.
Yes.
They get mad that I don't give them the book, but then they have it
And
on
they
the
don't read
shelf, and then you go there, you hear the spine crack. Like, you never even cracked this open. Yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, I had friends ask me, they're like, well, what did your mom say? And I'm like, well, I never showed it to her. And especially before it got published, and they're like, oh my God. And I think that, like, even if she was upset with the portrayal, number one, I don't call it memoir, so plausible deniability.
Right.
And also, if she had a problem with it, I wasn't going to change it. So,
I think these are
Kick the
so important. These are such important stories to tell because people are seeing themselves they may not be your personal experience, but they're going to relate to those types of parents or those types of situations. And I think it's so helpful in a memoir form to see that you can be real and honest. And I think as a reader, that there's just so much to hang on to with that. And I just really applaud you for being so honest and personal.
Like ripping off a Band-Aid.
So-
Like,
Right,
hey, I got a tattoo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, they do those.
Yeah.
They do those plastic things now. Sorry. How am I supposed to follow that, right? Yeah, I mean, like, I think that one of my things for me is like it's gosh, how do I go about this? First of all, like I mean, my books are very personal, but not autobiographical, and like I do make that distinction. And look, while I was working on Twin Cities, I made a lot of phone calls asking for a lot of apology, just like apologizing a lot. But it was also an opportunity. I mean, to your question of like why now, to be frank, I think it was just coincidental. Because I mean, I came up with the idea for Twin Cities many years ago, but I was working on other comics and I was working on other things. So it was only just like it was only coincidental and appropriate that that around 2020, wonderful times. That around 2020 is when I had the opportunity to sit down and work on it, and it was also around the time when. So Twin Cities, it's about multiple things, but it is predominantly exploring the concept of siblinghood as well, and how is that tied to identity, and how is that tied to where we're from. So again, I grew up in a Mexican town, but also very heavily influenced by American culture, and those clashes can seem very fun superficially, but they're also very odd because they are very, very, very different at their own cores. And my relationship with my siblings is, well, it's very positive nowadays, but it wasn't always like that. Anyone here with siblings will tell you that it's roller coasters without safety belts. And there are loops on that. And so, yeah, so for me, it was just more of like, while I was writing it and reflecting on what my experiences were with my siblings, what my experiences were growing up in my hometown, and how do I reflect that, but also trying to put that on display for people that have never been there, and in a way of that it's honest and sincere, but also emblematic and, well, I guess celebratory. So yeah, I mean, like, why now? I think it was just more of like, well, that's while I was doing it, and now that it's out, it's like, well, did I really close that chapter on my life? Not really, because I mean, I still have conversations with my siblings that were like, yeah, what was that all about? Like, what did we go through? And we're still kind of digging into all those things. So it wasn't necessarily that something got solved for now, but I am glad that while working on these books, I have been given the opportunity to explore these things, and it's an ongoing thing. And yeah, I mean, like, I try to stay positive about it, because if I've accomplished this much of putting this in print, of being able to express this, but also knowing that there's more to do so, then that gives me the opportunity to, like, okay, well, that means that there's more to know. And more to learn from, and I like that. I like that feeling, and also just constantly revisiting the idea of like, half of my life I've been living in the U.S. I have no idea how to express that, of like what that does to your identity, of like, I grew up in one place and then I moved to another one, and now I've been living here way longer than I was over there. Am I still from there? Geez. So buy me a drink. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, so those are the things of like, why now? It's like, well, that's because that's where I'm at. So, yeah. So.
Well, I guess this is more specifically for you. Was there a conscious decision to not write a straight memoir? Did you make that choice?
I mean, I'm going to quote Victoria: "Plausible deniability." No, I mean, like, it's just. Yeah, I guess I'm just not that ready to get like super personal with like like where like putting myself as a character, and like so yeah, no, it's yeah, I think that like fictionalizing it a bit gives me the opportunity to stay focused on the themes, but without necessarily like opting out of like, well, that's how I experienced it, but how did someone else experience it? So it's
Yeah, I hope that answered the question.
It did, thank you. So we've got about less than 15 minutes now. Do we have any
Sorry.
questions? No,
No,
it's
not at all.
amazing. Do we have any questions from the audience?
I have a question for all you guys. So I feel like everybody here has a story that they have where that they want to share to give people that feeling that they've had at one point in time. And so we have this story that, that is ingrained in ourselves, but how important is story structure? When should that come in? You have the story that you want to tell straight ahead, but then it might be not good enough for editors and stuff like that for an audience to, consume. And then how do you deal with rewrites to that? It's your own personal story.
Got it. Okay.
Yeah. I mean, for me, because it's fictionalized, and I went into it with that knowledge, because I came from film and television, which is very structural, like very Save the Cat, all that stuff, beat boards, all that jazz. And my last series was also very, very structured in a very traditional, like kind of Hollywood style. When I started this book, I didn't really know how to write memoir. That's part of the reason why it's fiction, is because I needed structure. So I actually first laid out all of my memories, like all the stuff that I wanted to put into the book, and then I put it into a fiction structure. And then that's why it's not memoir, because there are a lot of points in it, and the arrangement of the things was all meant to fit into a storytelling structure that made sense to me as a storyteller. But I'm sure that the memoirists have a different point of view on that.
I read a lot.
yeah. Go ahead.
Oh no, I made up a lot of shit, but
Oh, did you? Okay.
I'll continue. Just please.
So in my particular case, it's about a slice of life. 3 weeks of the life of Dan Santat. How did he start out, and how did he change? And it was a transformative trip. But with that, there's the truth, and then there's a bending of the truth. Now, the best way I can describe this is everything actually happened, but maybe not in the order and not the circumstances that happened. So, for example, I did sneak into Wimbledon, but that literally was the second day of the trip, and it was with somebody else. But if you were to craft a story, and your big thing happens in chapter 2 of the book, then the rest of it's just like, okay, well, that was underwhelming, right? So you move things around, and sneaking into Wimbledon becomes like the big thing that represents your growth, right? And that's where I had trouble writing about my parents, because there is a truth, and just kind of going off about what we were saying about just having a catharsis of that. It can be anger, but I think there's something about just shouting out your anger that is very therapeutic. It makes you feel better. You might not resolve anything, but there is something that just takes that steam out of you. Now, with this particular case, just having the slice of life, you're just really examining the transformation of the events. And maybe I was open for certain things to be malleable, because it was more important for me to capture the spirit of the characters and the feelings that were going on during that point. Like, it doesn't necessarily have to be what exactly happened in that circumstance, but it still happened, just certain things were changed. And that's what I meant about having it, teach you how to make a memoir. Ultimately, it's 100% about story. You can have events that happen, but you could tell the story and it could be dull. But if you tell it the right way, it can be enlightening.
That's literally what I meant when I said I just made shit up. That's not true. What I meant to say is that's the fun way of putting it, but the better way of putting it is that, the same events happen, but you kind of had to I kind of had to rearrange the way that they happened, or the conversation was in a different place. One example is that there's a scene where my friend and I go to the movies, and in the book we watched Pirates of the Caribbean 2, I think. And it was just a fun la la la, let's just watch movies. No, that's what happened in real life. But in the book, we watch Pirates of the Caribbean, and there's an important conversation about what does it when people are hitting each other. Like, is that a bad thing? Like, why do they do that? That conversation never happened in real life, but it was just a conduit of like, well, we're moving the story along. Also in real life, we watched the last Harry Potter movie, but I was drawing that part by the time, like, during the whole, like, J.K. Rowling is a TERF stuff, so I was like, I'm like, as far away from it as possible, but I think, like, the rule of thumb is that even though, like, those events were different and how they played out, it's like, well, do they give the reader the same emotions that you got? Like, it doesn't have, like, Maya Angelou, like, it's not about, like, what they said, it's about how they make you feel.
Right.
So, yeah, that's how I approached mine.
I mean, I think the cliche is correct. Writing is rewriting, right? So, like, so when you're coming up with a story and you're trying to, like, get something across, I do think that there's, like, a lot of, also, there's, like, a lot of ways of, like, well, what's your main idea? Like, what's your main goal? And keeping and keeping that as the objective of getting there and where you're going with that. And, you know, just like songs, there's no one right way to do it. You know, like, there's different types of story structure, there's different types of, you know, story ideas, and so on and so forward. But I do think that it helps, like, you know, like, for instance, if I were to tell you, like, my work process is just like trying to find the central idea, and then I write an outline, and then I write like you know, like, all the things that are happening more specifically, and then I start writing a script. And while all that is happening, I'm also tightening up, very similar to what they all mentioned, of just like, well, that's not quite right, or this or that. And I'm I like to keep those things in focus of just, like, you know, if you have a specific idea of where you're going with it, then keeping that as the center, and then everything else you're just building around that, very much like you're building a story structure. And yeah, I mean, like, but also, like, you know, if you look at a bunch of other different examples, like, for instance, the graphic novel Be Prepared, it's based on 2 summer camps, but the book just takes place during one. And if you compare that, and I will compare it for something like, you know, amongst other memoirs, something like Tipu is the Best We Could Do, where it's just like 70 years of history into one single book, but it's all about the struggles of family in order to move forward as people that leave their homeland, or even something like Fun Home, where it's so detailed and so true to what happened, but, you know, they all have different story structures, but they all also have a main argument or a main theme that they focus on. So yeah, I mean, like, I think that kind of comes into play when we're exploring these ideas. It's like some of it is identity, some of it is a little more than that, some of it is a particular social issue, some of it is, you know, and you can get very specific with that, or you can also get rather broad of, like, what's it like living in San Diego in the 2000s? And it's like, well, I'm going to draw all of San Diego, but, like, no, then you start getting specific of, like, what was happening in the culture around the times and so on and so forth. So yeah, I mean, it's a lot of work. Not that it doesn't happen, but rare is the person who just picks up the page 1, and starts drawing it, and that becomes page 1 of the actual final book. Very rare, but it can yeah, exactly. But, because again, there's rewriting that goes into it and so on.
Yeah.
So.
I didn't make the script until the very end, actually.
Marvel method, I
process is
see.
wild.
My process
You went
was
the Marvel method.
stupid. I literally drew the book, and I filled the speech bubbles.
Wild.
I'm not kidding.
Who was
that's
your
what I
editor,
did.
Stan Lee?
Yes.
Actually,
And it was
I
500 pages originally, so they're drawn. There's more pages.
I was like, what can fit in this speech bubble?
Wow. Yeah.
And that's how I literally.
I know.
I'm never doing that again. Don't do that. Don't.
That is
ever.
wild.
I'm never doing it again. Anyway, I know I'm taking up time.
But I will say that, like what Jose was saying, all of my books that I've written, I've actually always started with the climax. Like, I know the pivotal point where characters are going to change and what's going to happen in that moment. Same thing, like this book, even though that climax was something that happened in real life, I knew that that was like the inflection point. So then from there, I got to be like, what led us to this point? And then what happens after? And that's the same for like my fantasies too. I do the exact same thing where I'm like, okay, what is the most important moment, and what is it that I'm trying to say? Like, what is the message here? And so, yeah, like if you're working on memoir, like I would find that moment first to be like, okay, what is my climax? What is like the moment where all the characters are going to change, and where, you know, everything goes from one side to the other, and then everything else can build around that.
I read a memoir recently that I will just say was boring. And I thought a lot about that. Like, is it this person's life that's boring? Is it a terrible thing to say? Or is it how they wrote the story, what they chose to focus on?
Yeah.
I think it's that.
And
Drop their name. Drop their name.
it's none of yours. I enjoyed all of them.
It's like
very
Nan
much.
Dantat.
But was there that feeling that like, oh, I got to punch this up in places, you know, to sell
Sure.
these, to sell
As
it?
David Sedaris will even openly say, like, okay, well, if it was really the way it played out, it would be a very boring book. Yeah.
Yeah.
And now we got to wrap it up. Do it.
Rapid fire question.
Rapid fire question. I see. Quick hand.
I have an agent, and so I pitched her the book first, and then she sent it out on submission to multiple publishers at a time. And I think that's how most of us did it. Like it's very rare that a publisher is going to accept unsolicited manuscripts. So you want to have an agent first, and then they'll be the ones to send it to
Yes.
publishers.
I've had a long working relationship with my editor since 2012. Started in picture books, and then just kind of worked into a relationship. It's a very rare case you're going to find an editor that just speaks to your soul and just pulls the best out of you.
I love Connie.
And if you find that person, you hold on to that person for dear life. There's always been this debate of whether you are beholden to publisher or editor, and I've chosen, like my editor brings out the best in me.
Yeah, I had an agent he like submitted my stuff. Like he had all like his editor friends like, all right, go you. But the way that my agent found me was through a tweet, which was very wild. Actually, this is a link that I sent to everybody about like finding a graphic novel agent or finding a publisher or like submitting your stuff. But Victoria has a really good blog post about finding an agent or submitting your stuff to publishers. I highly recommend it. It's what I sent everybody.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, it's just on my website, victoriaying.com, and blog, and then I have both like how to submit to agents and also what to put into a graphic novel pitch packet, like all of the information that you need in there.
It's so good.
And can you quickly all say where we can find you online?
I'll start just because I already started. Yeah, so I have a website, victoriaying.com, also on Twitter and Instagram at Victoria Yang, just my name. Who knows how long I'll be on Twitter for, but,
Right.
for now.
Yeah, I'm pretty much staying on Twitter as long as the librarians are there. That's the
yeah.
only reason why it's that little trash fire. I'm at dsantat at all platforms, and then my website is www.dansantatbooks.com.
My website is debleeart.com, and every social media platform, unfortunately, I'm stuck to the username JDebbiel, which is JDEBBIEL. It was the only username available on tumblr.com in 2012.
Good times. So to answer the previous question, I wanted to make a joke about it, but like just because we're wrapping out of time, one of the editors that I work with the most is Whitney Leopard, and Whitney Leopard and I both went to the same art school, and we just hit it off. Like we became very good friends. Then we met in Los Angeles. Then we continued meeting up in Los Angeles, and we always wanted to work together. And when the opportunity was there, like I gave her a couple of proposals. She liked a few, and it's been wonderful ever since. She is an amazing editor, and the other editors that I've worked with is because of they haven't ever since found my work, and I've been seeked out that way. You can find me at josepimienta.com. There's also a few socials, but they're also on my website. It's my full name. There's some pictures there. Yeah. That's yeah.
All right, thank you everybody for being on the panel and the
Thank you for
audience.
being here.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for having us.